isn't, I guess, in a regular lecture situation. Well, in any case, this is going to be more a chat than a formal talk, and it's a project that I've been working on. Well, I wrote years ago with my collaborator William Abrams two books about Orwell, The Unknown Orwell and Orwell the Transformation, which were semi-biographical studies taking him up through the Spanish Civil War. We never intended to write a full biography, and there was a very complicated series of events involving the very difficult second wife and widow, but that's another story. The first book, The Unknown Orwell, dealt with Orwell when he was Eric Blair. He was born, as probably most of you may know, he was born Eric Arthur Blair on June 25th, 1903, in India, where his father was a minor civil servant in the opium department, which was opium was totally legal to be grown in India, but not consumed in India, except to a limited extent, mostly to be sold to China. He returned home when he was an infant with his mother and his older sister. His father remained in India until 1911. And so, in a sense, even though he was an infant, I think one of the origins of his sense of authority, I think, is he was, in a sense, the man of the house in his very earliest years. Even though his mother, Ida, who was Anglo-French, was quite a powerful personality. I think, unlike his father. I mean, his father was fine, but I think the mother, in a way, was a stronger figure. But also, as preface, interest in Orwell has never been stronger, which is quite amazing, considering that it's 70 years since his death in January 1950. And of course, rather the ironic situation is that Trump has been absolutely fabulous in terms of interest in Orwell. Particularly, the sales of 1984 skyrocketed when his press secretary, or whoever she was, I think, used the term alternate facts and other realities. The whole sense that we're living in an Orwellian universe was accentuated by Trump. So maybe that's one of the very few benefits that I can think of that Trump, if any, that Trump has brought us. But even so, 1984, an Animal Farm. I don't know if it's still true, but I think for a long while, every American high school student virtually read those books. And also the irony, which is again not what really I'm planning to talk about, is Orwell was tremendously helped in terms of interest. In the first stage of interest, the interest in Animal Farm in 1984 was very much, well, actually, I mean to talk about it towards the end of this talk, was very much driven by the Cold War. Maybe I'll get back to that later. But my current interest, and I'm trying to a very short manuscript, which probably nobody will want to publish. Maybe as my previous book, I'll self-publish it. I'm working on a very short manuscript on the influence of war, WAR, on not Evelyn War, although Orwell had rather surprisingly was a great admirer of Evelyn Wars, and they were sort of rather improbable friends. I think this aspect of Orwell has not been sufficiently investigated, except for the influence of the Spanish Civil War, I'll get to as well. And I think particularly the influence of the First World War upon Orwell has been comparatively neglected. And the other fascinating thing to me about Orwell, in a sense he's paradoxical, and in a sense not. He's very much a deeply patriotic socialist, which is not a combination that you would think is a natural combination. On the other hand, it's in a very strong British tradition. I hope that's not my tink. Well, anyway, a very strong British tradition in which, say, William Blake, we shall build, the great hymn of the Labour Party, we shall build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, which I think has that patriotic feeling about a deep sense of Englishness that is very, very strong in some very radical figures. Very strong in William Blake, very strong in William Morris, and a modern exemplar, I think, is the great historian E.P. Thompson, who both was very English, at the same time he was very much a figure on the left. And I think where I hope that I may be able to make a contribution, I think the influence upon Orwell of the First World War has in shaping him and creating this patriotic socialist has not been sufficiently examined. And if I have a contribution to make, but there's a vast literature on Orwell, and it may be that others have I've read a lot of it. I don't think anybody can claim to have read it all. Unless they're lying, or maybe some have. Maybe John Rodden, who's written many books about Orwell, has. I don't think this aspect of the influence of the First World War and the period just before the First World War has been sufficiently explored. In any case, as I say, Orwell came back with his mother and older sister, and he went to live in a sort of quintessential English town, Henley-on-Thames, famous for the regatta, and then also they moved to a little village next to it, Shiplake. But it was, on the Thames. It was a very traditional place to live. He went to a nun school, which I just heard earlier today in another Orwell talk. It may have shaped his anti-Catholicism, but he went there as an infant, and then at the age of 8, which is very much the English tradition among his class. And another aspect, which is something of a matter of debate, is Orwell said about himself that he was a member of the lower, upper, middle class, in which he said that definition means a member of the upper middle class without money. His family, and again, this is, I hope I'm not, well, it's for good or bad, I have a certain reputation for being digressive. and I hope I won't be. I hope I'll be able. Maybe somebody, Leslie, as a former student, has the right to sort of wave a hand and imply, "Get back to the point." but
Expressions are so interesting. Why would we do that?
Okay, I'll digress. We're among friends. The family had money. And again, it's a wonderful example that history always changes. Orwell's family didn't have money, but his ancestors did. And where did that money come from? Until, of course, the last 10 years or so, nobody paid any attention from that to that. But now, of course, there's intense interest in that because the money came from slavery. And Orwell's great, well, I may have the greats, not the sufficient number of greats. His great-great-grandfather, I think his first name was Charles Blair, had plantations in Jamaica and was a slave owner. And his son, or he himself, married the daughter of an earl, and so the family had. Some people regard Orwell as an outsider. I don't think that's true. I mean, his father had a £400 a year, which was an adequate income, but his father was the 10th son of a vicar. The money, enough money to live. The ideal in Britain is to live without working, live on a private income. They didn't have enough money for that, but they had class status. The class status, I think, remains even if there's very little money to support it. And Orwell had very much the traditional education of that class, but he needed a scholarship. So he went, as is customary, and I think is still customary. All these children write memoirs saying, "I hated being at school," but nevertheless, when their parents, they send their sons, more than their daughters, but their daughters as well, I think they still send them to the so-called British prep schools, which are different. There's a prep school here is more at the secondary level. In England, the term prep school refers to where you go to school, a boarding school, from 8 to 13. And Orwell was sent off. And I think it's significant. He basically was sent off just as his father was coming to live home. So he never really, other than vacations, he never really grew up with his father. And he went to this very highly regarded school called St. Cyprian's. And he wrote, and some of you may know, one of his most famous essays, which it's another long story, which was not published until after his death because of libel. He wrote a famous essay called "Such Were the Joys," which is a line from Blake, and of course he's using it ironically, because it's a picture of his prep school about how much he hated it, and how awful it was, and how badly he was treated. But nevertheless, he got, I think, again, it's a paradox that so happens in England. These schools, and I think it's still true, they teach people well. They teach people how to write. They teach people how to present themselves in elegant essays, the sort of things they have to do in examinations. And the theory, of course, which I don't know whether it's all educationally legitimate, is that knowing Greek and Latin is very good for your training you to think better. And so it was a sort of rote education in this theory of the style of the time, but in many ways he was well trained. But in terms of the influence, and these schools particularly, I mean, at the time of, this is just before the First World War. He goes to the school in 1911, and this is the height of Edwardian sense of empire. Britain as top dog. He becomes a member of the cadet corps, as everybody did. These schools exist to train people, well, frequently for business careers, but otherwise to be rulers of the empire, rulers of the state. And he said in another essay, which he wrote later, which is quite significant, an essay that he wrote at the time of the Second World War, called "My Country, Right or Wrong." He said, the first military thing I was aware of, I wore a little sailor cap, and I recited the slogan, "We want aid and we won't wait," which was to build the great new battleships, the dreadnoughts. So there's serving the state, and a deep sense of patriotism, and a deep sense of being trained to do that, or accepting the glorious England as being the greatest country, the top dog. I think, but not being too boastful about it, was shaped by that. And then, of course, again, it's a bit paradoxical. The war breaks out in 1914, and of course, and there are maps at the school, and all boys of the school are in the army or the military services and are dying. So the intense sense of Britain at war, this country that I'm being trained to serve, of course, is accentuated by the First World War. And then the wonderful thing that happens, and I have a personal connection with this, because actually my collaborator and myself, who were the ones who discovered it, Orwell's very first publications when he was a schoolboy in the local Henley paper were two intensely patriotic poems. The first one, which was triggered by a cousin of his, one of his aunt's sons on his mother's side, was killed in the very first months of the First World War. And Orwell wrote this almost embarrassingly jingoistic poem saying, you must enlist. You're a coward if you don't enlist. It was an enlistment poem. And it was published in the local paper, and he was in favor at school about it. And then his second poem, which he wrote some years later, when he might have beginning to have doubts about all this, was on the death of Kitchener. Lord Kitchener, the famous Minister of War with the great mustaches, and who was drowned when he was taking a ship to Russia. And he wrote a poem saying, how wonderful Kitchener was. It was an assignment that all the boys in the school were to write. But it seems to me that growing up in this Edwardian period, which of course was not wartime, but then the war itself was tremendously important, and then that would be accentuated. He went to the most famous, after St. Cyprian's, he went on with a scholarship. But people frequently sort of misunderstand this. He went on a scholarship, a so-called King Scholar, to Eton. The most famous English public school. Called public schools because they're open to anybody who can qualify and can pay, rather than from a restricted group of people. But the term public school, of course, is a bit confusing. They're very expensive, except if you're a King's Scholar. But the King's Scholarships were not given on the basis of need. They were absolutely on the basis of ability. Now, possibly he couldn't have afforded to go to a public school if he had to pay fees. But he didn't get the scholarship because for financial need. It was on the basis of taking a barricade of tests. But he arrived there in 1917, and again, I think he was then more cynical. He was a sort of cynical schoolboy. But nevertheless, I think being at Eton during the war, the last year of the war, there would have been an intense sense of the war. Because the Etonians, the young people he would have just known, and when he got there, maybe they'd be at school together for a year, would go off to be officers. And of course, I have the figures somewhere. I mean, it's an incredible number of because they were the young lieutenants, the young officers, in which there was a very high death rate. So the old Etonians, the sense that Etonians were dying because of the war, and of course he was also active in the officers. Well, here I don't know if you can see it. That's Orwell. That's swimming at Eton. But this is the officer corps. I think Orwell's maybe this one. Here, incidentally, is a photo. Let's see. That's a photograph of Orwell as a baby with his mother. Um, and there was a huge bonfire when there was an armistice. So I think even though he was beginning to. There's a famous remark he made to his friend Cyril Connolly at Eton. Whatever happens, we're going to emerge as a second-rate nation after the war. So there might have been a certain cynicism, which is not this particular group of Etonians, who were regarded as the British term as being rather bolshy and being somewhat cynical about the country's values. But nevertheless, I think that they were deeply imbued with patriotic values, and by class and wartime experience, I think Orwell as patriot was shaped by the first war, just before the First World War and the First World War experience. Well, I thought I wouldn't have enough to say, but most academics never know when to stop. But I should move on. I'll skip the next war, which has been written about extensively by many, and is the subject of the other book that William Abrams and I wrote, Orwell: The Transformation, which discusses. They're available. Stanford has put them out in a single paperback if anybody's interested, and I think they're still in print. The first book, The Unknown Orwell, goes up to when he first uses the name Orwell, which is an invented name, for the publication of Down and Out in Paris and London in 1933. This book discusses him from 1933 through the Spanish Civil War. And politically, I don't think there's any question that the Spanish Civil War was the most important war in terms of shaping his ideas. He was moving steadily to the left, but gradually. Sometimes it's said when he became, as you probably know, a policeman in Burma from 1922 to 1927, a police officer. I mean, he wasn't pounding the beat, and he had criticisms. He became an anti-imperialist, but gradually, sometimes people say he, became violently against the empire when he came back in 27. It was much more a gradual development, but he certainly became more and more anti-imperial. He was moving gradually to the left. Most importantly, in his book that he wrote, published by the Left Book Club, The Road to Wigan Pier, he wrote about the Depression. He was becoming more and more sympathetic to left-wing ideas. He was moving towards socialism, but he really did not become, and again, he became, through the Spanish experience, he wrote a letter to Cyril Connolly. He said, "I now, more than ever before, I've become a democratic socialist as I understand it." I mean, you could always qualify it. So he became deeply committed to socialism through the experience of Spain. He arrived in Barcelona. People generally say he intended to fight. I think it's more accurate to say he knew that it was a possibility, but his initial idea was to go to Spain to write about it, and write articles about it, not necessarily to fight. But he arrived in Barcelona in December 1936. He found the atmosphere, the feeling in the city, which in fact was marginally less radical than it had been. The war had started in July 1936. The sense of egalitarianism, the sense of a new society, the elimination of seigneur and so forth, the comradeship. He found it absolutely mind transforming and exhilarating, and he said, I must fight for this. By chance, again, it's a long story I won't go into, he came to Spain under the auspices of the Independent Labour Party, not the Communist Party. He talked to Harry Pollitt, but Harry Pollitt, quite rightly, from the Communist point of view, didn't trust him and wouldn't help him. So he to get to Spain. So he went to Spain under the auspices of the Independent Labour Party. And he was a political naive in some ways, particularly about Spanish politics, as probably everybody was, and non-Spanish. And the Independent Labour Party was affiliated with something called POUM, which was a semi-Trotskyite left organization, and he joined the POUM militia because that was the easy thing to do, and he went to fight, but then he came back on leave, and that's when the so-called May Day started. He was actually wanting to transfer to the communist group, the International Brigade, because they were where the action was in Madrid, and also they were much better organized than the POUM. But then the communists, the socialists, the so-called socialists, and the communists, there was street fighting in Barcelona between them and the anarchists and the POUM. And when all saw his colleagues being attacked, there was no question which side he was going to be on. So to sum up, the extremely important effect of the Spanish Civil War was to make him a deeply committed socialist, and because he saw what the Russians were up to, a deeply committed anti-communist. The communist line was what was accepted in the left in Britain, and when he wrote his masterpiece, Homage to Catalonia, about the Spanish Civil War, it was very difficult to get it published. It was very difficult to get it reviewed. It sold very badly. It was a take. But there again, it's very important in the shaping of his later thought and his influence. He saw that the press, all over the English press, as well as other presses, were reporting what he saw as the totally untrue communist line about the situation in Spain, so he saw how truth could be, or falsehoods could be reported as if they were totally true. That history, I mean, it's very important in the origins of 1984. That history, or something that happened, a week ago or whatever, or years ago, ultimately, could be transformed and totally misrepresented in order to serve political purposes. But then, Orwell is he has contrary ideas. He's such a brilliant writer that he writes with conviction. So actually, and people tend to don't notice this very much. The other odd thing that happened on his return from Spain is that he became a pacifist, and he decided that war would that all Russia, Germany, Great Britain, they were all imperialist states, and there was no good side if they should fight one another. And for about 2 years, he felt there shouldn't be a war, even though he recognized how evil Germany was. But again, he flipped when he woke up the day after the whatever the date was, the Russian-German pact was signed, and he said, well, now, this is impossible. Britain will have to go to war against Germany. But then the Second World War was tremendously important for his thought. In two pieces that he wrote. One on. I should try and end in about 5 or 10 minutes. A wonderful pamphlet called "The Lion and the Unicorn," and again, the title of it is "The Lion and the Unicorn," which are the royal beasts, the beasts that support the royal coat of arms. So in a way, that's very patriotic. The subtitle, after the colon, is "Socialism and the English Genius." And then he also wrote this very significant essay called "My Country, Right or Left" at that time, where he says, I was just imbued when I was growing up with this deep love of my country. But oddly, he didn't want these two writings reprinted, and I think the reason that a major reason he didn't want them reprinted was that what he said was going to happen didn't happen. But what he argued in "The Lion and the Unicorn," it's a wonderful description of what England, the famous line about England, which is almost Burkean, is England is a country, is a family. England is a family with the wrong members in control. The bedridden aunt and the cranky uncle, rather than the bright young people, are running the family. But it's a family. And he's almost sentimental. Also, I wrote a book called "The English People," which he wrote during the war, but a little book, but it wasn't published until 1947 for various reasons. But he said, in order to win the war, it's necessary that Britain become a socialist country, that the means of production be nationalized, that the House of Lords be eliminated. He said the monarchy could probably stay. At least he made all these predictions of the great social transformations, which would be a lot of them be necessary during the war, and certainly after the war. He said, we have to do this in order to get the sufficient support from the people in order to win the war. It wasn't necessary, and of course, after the war, the welfare state came into existence, so to a limited extent there was socialism in Britain, but it's not a socialist country, and less so now than it was then. But the war itself, the experience of the war, committed him even more deeply in shaping his ideas and making him, claiming that there was going to be a necessity for socialism, which was not true, but also, very importantly, that socialism was what should happen. He wanted a socialist society, but he claimed as that England, the good things of England, he has long sort of somewhat sentimental passages about the English gentleness, which I think is sometimes exaggerated, love of flowers. There's an interesting book, Rebecca Solnit, Orwell's Roses, that's just been published, that England will stay the same, but ever different. And of course, one of the great themes that I've always been interested in and Orwell in a way is an example of that, is that England, and England has this great capacity to change to a great extent in order to stay as much the same as it was. And well, we can go on about that. But the experience of the Second World War, I think, was very important in shaping his thoughts, his political thoughts, but then of course, it was followed at the end of the war with the Cold War. What Orwell is cited in the Oxford English Dictionary as being the first person. He's the person cited, as the dictionary does. He's cited as the first person to use the term Cold War, which he used about the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West. In a piece he wrote, a column he wrote in 1945. Though the term is generally Walter Lippmann wrote a book about the Cold War in 1947, which is generally given credit for making the term much better known. And Orwell was deeply committed to the Cold War. He was profoundly anti-communist. He was profoundly anti-totalitarian. But this has led him to be, I think, erroneously co-opted by the right. He did not believe that there should be a war against the Soviet Union. He did not believe that the Soviet Union should cease to exist. He did not believe that the Communist Party anywhere in the West should be outlawed. But he did believe that as made so vivid, both in Animal Farm in 1984, that the Soviet Union was demonstrated how a totalitarian society can behave very badly and horribly, so in that sense, that was the sense in which the Cold War shaped his thinking. And also, ironically, Animal Farm in 1984 became very. Louis Menard has said that 1984 was the single most powerful cultural weapon in the Cold War, and both the CIA and its British office, semi-secret office in the Foreign Office in Britain, they spent untold amounts of money arranging for translations into innumerable languages of Animal Farm and 1984. And of course, their subsidies were secret or semi-secret. And I think it's an interesting question. Isn't it a good thing that those books should be available to many other people? Is it damned because the source of the money was a little dicey? But of course, this was, as you know, 1984 was not published. It was published in June and July of 1949, and he died in January 1950. But by that time, because of Animal Farm, he'd become an extremely well-known author. And of course, he was all in favor of countries becoming socialists. And he frequently recognized, in one of his more slightly off-putting phrases in one of his essays written during the Second World War, was, there needs to be a revolution. And if there's some blood in the streets, that's all right. So he wasn't necessarily opposed to a revolution to bring about a socialist society. But what he argued, and I think with a great deal of accuracy, in order for a socialist society to be preserved, to stay socialist, you need to have a frequent change of leadership. Because he argued, and I think, what happens in the world proves him right, is that the people who create the revolution, who may at that point be, so to speak, good guys, they then become committed to staying in power. And they will do anything. They will suppress. He cites in Russia the Cronkite, whatever was the naval mutiny, and the brutal suppression of that. When the communists have been established, that the people in power will preserve power, and do anything they can. And of course, that's one of the great themes of 1984. And the only way that a socialist society can preserve itself if there's a turnover and new people come in, and that turnover should happen, quite often. So, just in conclusion, that it seems to me that these various experiences, and most particularly his two experiences in the First World War and also the Second World War, those both deeply reinforced his patriotism, and his experience in the Spanish Civil War deeply reinforced. Well, obviously he wasn't a socialist. Well, he might have been, but I don't think he was when he was a schoolboy. But the experience in the Second World War deeply reinforced both his patriotism and his socialism. And so I think using war as a way of discussing his evolution and his ideas, I hope is a useful tool. So I'll stop there.